The air in the University Medical School cadaver storage facility always held a specific chill, a deep, pervasive cold that burrowed into the bone regardless of the layers I wore. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the quiet hum of the refrigeration units, a constant, low thrumming that seemed to vibrate with the stillness of everything within these walls. The scent was clinical, antiseptic, laced with something deeper, metallic and earthy, a faint echo of what the facility contained. I preferred it to the sterile nothingness of an office. Here, the truth was laid bare, waiting for someone to listen. My breath plumed in front of me as I leaned closer to the stainless steel slab. Case File 7B, the official report declared, was an accidental fall. A man in his late 40s, found at the base of a defunct loading crane in a remote industrial area on the city's forgotten eastern edge. The police report, signed off by a tired-looking uniformed officer, detailed a tumble from significant height, consistent with the extensive trauma. The initial assessment by the medical examiner, a new colleague still finding his footing, concurred, impact injuries, consistent with gravity's brutal embrace. But gravity, I'd learned, was rarely the sole actor in a tragedy. It was often merely the final stagehand. I adjusted the articulating lamp, flooding the deceased's upper torso with a harsh, revealing light. The man's name, I remembered from the brief I'd skimmed, was Arthur. A common name, now a silent one. His skin, a pale gray against the white sheet, was a roadmap of blunt force trauma. Fractures riddled his skull, sternum, and limbs. His left arm was angled unnaturally, a jagged break visible through the skin. All consistent, yes, with a long drop onto unforgiving concrete. They missed something, I murmured, more to myself than to the silent room. The technician, a stoic man named David, had brought the body out for me an hour ago, then retreated to his console, monitoring the facility's vitals. He knew my routine. I didn't just examine, I listened. My gloved fingers traced the contours of the man's jaw. There was a subtle asymmetry, a slight deviation in the mandible that seemed too precise for the chaotic violence of a fall. I moved to the neck, carefully palpating the cervical vertebrae. Nothing immediately obvious, no textbook subluxation. But then, my thumb brushed against a small, raised area just beneath the left earlobe. It wasn't a bruise. It was too firm, too localized. I pulled back, tilting my head, scrutinizing the spot. It was barely visible, a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration, hidden by the hairline and the general postmortem pallor. Most eyes would glide over it, lost in the larger narrative of catastrophic injury. But my eyes had been trained to see the whispers. I retrieved my magnification loupe from my kit, clipping it onto my glasses. The faint mark resolved into a cluster of tiny, almost microscopic punctures. Not scratches from rough concrete, or fragments of debris. These were too regular, too deep for their size. Pinpricks, arranged in a small, irregular cluster. Like a constellation of miniature wounds. My internal clock, the one that usually ticks steadily through the methodical process, began to race. An accidental fall, especially from a height, rarely left such delicate, specific marks. The body would be a canvas of scrapes, contusions, and lacerations, yes, but these minute punctures spoke of something else entirely. Something intentional. I took a series of close-up photographs, adjusting the focus meticulously. Then I carefully swabbed the area, sealing the samples in sterile vials. This was the work I lived for. The forgotten details, the overlooked evidence that screamed its truth to those willing to hear. Next, I turned my attention to the deceased's hands. They were clenched, a common postmortem phenomenon, but the nails were intact, no obvious struggle. Yet, as I pried open the right hand, something caught my eye. Wedged deep beneath the ring. Finger's nail, a sliver of material. Again, something that could easily be missed or dismissed as environmental debris from the industrial site. But the industrial area was mostly rust and concrete dust. This looked different. I used fine-tipped forceps to carefully extract the sliver, placing it onto a microscope slide. Under higher magnification, its true nature became clear. It wasn't wood, or rust, or concrete. The kind of material used in high-end electronics, or perhaps, a specific type of bespoke accessory. Definitely not something one would find readily available in a derelict factory. These two details, the pinprick cluster and the acrylic fragment, were dissonant notes in the symphony of accidental fall. They sang a different tune, one of deliberate action, of proximity, of struggle. I moved back to the cadaver's head, examining the skull fractures. The primary impact point was the crown, consistent with the headfirst fall. But I noticed a secondary fracture line, almost hairline thin, extending from the temple towards the occipital bone. It wasn't a direct impact point, it was a radiating fracture. But its origin point felt off. I spent another hour, meticulously documenting every bruise, every fracture, every scrape. I measured angles, calculated forces. The overall picture of trauma was undeniable, consistent with a fall. But the story those injuries told was starting to diverge. The way the body landed, the distribution of some of the secondary impacts, the subtle rotational stress visible in the cervical spine. It was all there, hidden beneath the obvious. Someone had wanted this to look like an accident. The deceased, Arthur, hadn't simply fallen. He had been thrown, or pushed, or perhaps, incapacitated and then dropped. The pinpricks, the acrylic sliver, the subtle anomaly in the fracture patterns, they were all tiny threads, but together, they began to weave a tapestry of something far more sinister than an unfortunate misstep. The case file would need to be reopened. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning of what Arthur had to tell me. I pulled my lab coat tighter, the thick cotton offering scant protection, and navigated the narrow aisles between the stainless steel cabinets. Each cabinet held a story, or what was left of one, waiting for someone like me to decipher its final, silent testimony. My destination was Cabinet 7B, housing the remains of what the initial incident report had dismissed as a tragic, if unremarkable, accidental fall. A single sheet of paper, clipped to the handle, stated blunt force trauma, cranial, accidental. I knew the story: a construction worker, late at night, a slip on a scaffold, a fatal plunge. Case closed. But the detective who'd called me, a seasoned veteran with a gut feeling stronger than any official ruling, had asked for my unique perspective. And I trusted the detective's gut more than any rubber stamp on a form. With a soft hiss of displaced air, I pulled open the heavy drawer. Inside, nestled on a sterile tray, were the cleaned, articulated bones. The skeletal remains, a mosaic of off-white and pale yellow, were laid out meticulously. I took a moment, as I always did, to simply see them, to let the form speak to me before my analytical mind took over. The deceased had been a man, likely in his late 30s, early 40s, judging by the osteological markers. Robust, with well-developed muscle attachments, indicative of manual labor. Consistent with the official narrative so far. I wheeled the tray to my workstation, a stainless steel table bathed in the harsh, shadowless light of an overhead lamp. My tools were laid out: calipers, a magnifying visor, a dental pick, a high-intensity penlight, and a stereo microscope waiting patiently in the corner. I donned my examination gloves, the latex a thin barrier between my skin and the silent evidence. My initial scan was systematic, starting with the cranium, the primary site of reported trauma. The right parietal bone showed a significant fracture, a stellate pattern. Consistent with a high-impact fall onto a hard surface. The reports described a fall from considerable height onto concrete. The fracture fit. I traced the lines with a gloved finger, feeling the slight irregularities, the sharp edges where the bone had given way. Nothing immediately screamed foul play. I moved down the spine, checking for compression fractures, then the rib cage. This was where the narrative often diverged. A fall from height often resulted in multiple rib fractures, sometimes bilateral, sometimes radiating from the point of impact. I picked up the sternum, turning it under the light. Intact. Then the ribs, one by one. Left side, clean. Right side, clean. Until I reached the 7th rib, mid-axillary line, on the right. There it was. A hairline fracture. Subtle, almost imperceptible without the focused light and the magnifying visor. It wasn't a radiating fracture from the cranial impact, nor was it a typical compression fracture from the body striking the ground. This was a direct impact fracture, a clean break, almost like a localized blow. My brow furrowed. A fall from a scaffold, striking the head, would produce a cascade of injuries. A single, isolated rib fracture like this, without other associated trauma in the immediate vicinity, felt out of place. It was too precise. Too neat for the chaos of a fall. An oddity, I murmured to the empty room, my voice a low rumble against the hum of the refrigeration units. My internal clock reset. The official narrative, once a sturdy framework, now had a hairline crack running through it. I meticulously documented the finding, sketching the fracture pattern, noting its exact location and dimensions. I picked up the right hand, examining the metacarpals and phalanges. The small bones of the hand, particularly the distal phalanges, were often vulnerable in a struggle, either from striking out or attempting to ward off a blow. Under the microscope, zooming in on the 3rd distal phalanx of the right hand, I found it. A minute chip fracture, barely a millimeter in length, on the dorsal surface. And then another, even smaller, on the 5th. These weren't the kind of breaks you'd get from simply bracing a fall, which usually resulted in Cole's fractures of the wrist or impact fractures in the carpals. These were indicative of a glancing blow, or perhaps a forceful scrape against a rough surface, something that caused a small, localized trauma. A defensive injury. Or an offensive one. My breath hitched. The pieces weren't fitting the picture of a simple accident. A fall from a scaffold, a severe head injury. But then, a distinct, localized rib fracture, and these tiny, almost imperceptible chips on the fingers. It was as if two different stories were being told by the same body. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the sudden, stark realization that I was looking at something more sinister than a workplace tragedy. The initial ruling was wrong. The dead man hadn't just fallen. He had been done to. My gut, mirroring the detective's, clenched. This wasn't an accident. This was a meticulously disguised murder. The initial ruling was wrong. Fallen. I leaned closer, the scent of antiseptic and formaldehyde thick in the air. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile glow over the stillness. My gaze swept over the man's form, already catalogued and partially examined, but not by my eyes. The official report cited a cranial impact from a heavy falling object, consistent with an accidental death in an industrial setting. A slip, a collapsing stack of equipment. Plausible, on the surface. But my gut, honed by years of deciphering the silent narratives of the deceased, screamed otherwise. I reached for my kit, pulling out a pair of nitrile gloves, the thin material snapping against my skin. My specialized magnifying visor, equipped with variable light sources, settled comfortably over my eyes. I started with the most obvious injury, the skull fracture. The report described it as blunt force trauma, consistent with impact. I saw something else. They weren't random. They were parallel, shallow, and consistent in their spacing, as if left by a serrated edge, not a smooth, heavy surface. A subtle, yet damning detail. My focus shifted to the man's hands. The official notes mentioned abrasions, typical for someone trying to break a fall. Under my magnification, the abrasions told a different story. They were deep, almost gouges, on the backs of his knuckles, consistent with defensive wounds, not impact from a fall. More importantly, embedded within the ragged skin of his right palm, a sliver of material glinted. It was a fragment, barely a millimeter long, dark and metallic. I carefully extracted it with fine-tipped tweezers, placing it into a sterile evidence bag. Its surface was oddly textured, not like common metal. I moved systematically, examining every inch of the body. The man's work uniform, a heavy-duty coverall, was torn in places, but the tears seemed to radiate from specific points, not general wear and tear. I used my specialized forensic vacuum, its gentle suction collecting any loose fibers, dust, or particulate matter from the fabric and surrounding gurney. Under the oblique light, a faint shimmer of iridescent particulate adhered to the coarse weave of his trousers, alien to the concrete dust and grease typical of the facility. I bagged samples, each meticulously labeled. The cranial fracture was significant, but it was the subtle damage elsewhere that truly contradicted the accident ruling. I gently manipulated the man's left arm. A faint crepitus, a grating sensation, told me something was wrong with the ulna. X-rays, already taken, showed a clean break. But my hands, trained to feel the nuances of bone, detected a rotational stress fracture, a twisting injury, not a simple break from impact. It was a break consistent with someone struggling, being held, or having their arm forcibly twisted. The official X-rays, focused on the skull, had overlooked this. I requested new, specific imaging. While the new scans were being prepared, I focused on identification. The man had no wallet, no ID on him, typical for someone working in a secure facility. Standard procedure involved dental records and fingerprints. His fingerprints were logged in the facility's security system, a requirement for all personnel. I cross-referenced them. The system immediately returned a match. Arthur Finch, I murmured, the name feeling heavy on my tongue. The system provided a basic employee profile, a facilities maintenance technician, 38 years old, employed by the company for 7 years. But the system also flagged a secondary, older record. Arthur Finch wasn't just a maintenance technician. My brow furrowed as I delved deeper into the linked historical data. His professional history was far more extensive than his current role suggested. Before his employment at the facility, Arthur Finch had been an environmental engineer, specializing in impact assessments. He'd worked for a prominent consultancy firm, involved in several high-profile projects, including a massive corporate development recently approved for construction on the city's waterfront, a project that had faced considerable environmental opposition and scrutiny. The meticulous nature of the accidental trauma, the defensive wounds, the unique trace evidence, the rotational fracture, it all painted a picture of a deliberate act, not a mishap. And now, the victim's true professional background added a whole new layer of motive, a layer that stretched far beyond the confines of this sterile facility. Arthur Finch, environmental engineer turned maintenance technician. What had he seen? What had he known? The initial ruling of accidental death was not merely wrong, it was a deliberate obfuscation. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message, carefully crafted, designed to be missed. And I had just peeled back its first, carefully constructed layer. The real work, the dangerous work, was just beginning. The initial ruling was wrong. The dead man hadn't just fallen. The primary injury, a massive cranial trauma, was consistent with a fall from a significant height, yes, but the pattern of secondary impacts on the body told a different story. They were too neat, too localized. A true accident, a tumble down a flight of concrete stairs, would have left a chaotic symphony of bruises and scrapes, a random scattering of minor injuries across the limbs and torso. This body presented a curated selection. I leaned closer, my breath pluming in the frigid air, examining the skin around the man's wrists. Not tight enough to break skin, but present enough to suggest restraint. My internal monologue raced, connecting these faint clues to the pristine state of his clothing, the lack of struggle. He hadn't fought. He couldn't have. He'd been immobilized, then dropped. The scene had been carefully constructed to mimic an accident, a tragic misstep. I photographed the indentations, then moved to his ankles, finding similar traces. Whoever did this was careful, but not perfect. They missed the small details, the ones only someone looking for a narrative beyond the obvious would catch. My mind solidified its conclusion: this was no accident. This was an execution, elaborately staged. I spent another hour, meticulously documenting every finding, every anomaly, until the digital camera's memory card was full and my notebook was dense with sketches and observations. The weight of what I discovered pressed down on me, heavy and cold as the air in the facility. The meeting room was stark, smelling faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. Across the polished oak table sat the medical examiner, a man whose career had been built on efficiency and avoiding controversy, and a lead detective from the city's homicide unit, his face a mask of practiced skepticism. I laid out my findings, my voice calm, methodical, presenting the evidence with the precision of a surgeon. I showed them the photographs, the atypical impact patterns, the faint ligature marks, the absence of defensive wounds, the subtle inconsistencies in the scene reconstruction. The cranial trauma is consistent with a fall, yes, I began, gesturing to a projection of the deceased's skull. But the secondary injuries, the specific points of impact on the torso and limbs, suggest placement, not uncontrolled tumbling. And these. I clicked to a close-up of the wrist indentations. These are consistent with temporary restraint. Not tight enough to cause significant trauma, but enough to immobilize. The medical examiner shifted in his seat, his gaze flicking between me and the detective. Marcus, we went over this. The initial assessment was clear. An unfortunate fall down a maintenance shaft. His tone was dismissive, edged with a weariness that felt more like annoyance than genuine concern. And my assessment, after a more thorough examination, is that the scene was manipulated, I countered, my voice unwavering. The body was dropped, not fallen. And the man was restrained beforehand. The detective finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. So you're suggesting someone staged this? To what end, Marcus? This was a maintenance worker. No enemies, no criminal record. Just a guy who had a bad day at work. I'm suggesting he was murdered, I stated plainly, meeting his gaze. The meticulousness implies a motive beyond a simple dispute. A muscle twitched in the medical examiner's jaw. Marcus, reopening this case would mean a complete re-evaluation of the initial report, a re-examination of the scene, a lot of resources. Are you absolutely certain you're not overthinking this? Seeing patterns that aren't actually there? The question hung in the air, a thinly veiled accusation that I was chasing ghosts, wasting their time. I am certain, I affirmed, my determination hardening. The evidence is subtle, but it's there. And it points away from an accident. The detective sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. Look, Marcus, we appreciate your thoroughness. But without anything more concrete. Anything that screams foul play to the untrained eye, it's a tough sell. We'd be opening a Pandora's box based on a hunch. It wasn't a hunch. It was forensic anthropology. But I knew arguing further in that room was pointless. The resistance was palpable, a wall of institutional inertia and professional pride. I gathered my notes, a knot of frustration tightening in my stomach. They didn't want to see it. Or worse, they couldn't see it. The dismissal had stung, but it also fueled a renewed sense of purpose. If they wouldn't look beyond the accident, I would. I pulled up the deceased's personnel file, digging deeper than the initial cursory glance. His name was Arthur Vance. 47 years old, a longtime employee of a major industrial conglomerate, Omnicorp Global, which operated the facility where he died. I scrolled through his employment history, looking for anything out of place. Performance reviews, commendations, disciplinary actions. Nothing. Clean. Too clean, perhaps. He was raising concerns about safety protocols, specifically regarding a new chemical compound being used in their manufacturing process, alleging it was being improperly handled and posed significant environmental risks. He even mentioned escalating his concerns to external regulatory bodies if internal action wasn't taken. A whistleblower. The staged accident, the immediate dismissal by official channels, the powerful corporation. The red flags weren't just waving, they were snapping violently in a gale. Arthur Vance hadn't just died, he had been made to die, and someone very powerful wanted that fact buried with him. I stared at the screen, the implications settling over me like a shroud. I was no longer just investigating a death, I was standing on the precipice of a conspiracy. The metallic tang of the meeting room still clung to my clothes, a phantom scent of dismissal and bureaucracy. They saw an accident. I saw a story of violence etched into bone, screaming for an audience. The resistance I'd met wasn't just frustrating, it was a fire under my skin. I couldn't let it rest. Not when the victim's narrative was so clearly being silenced. The fluorescent hum of the building was a familiar drone, a counterpoint to the profound silence within its chill chambers. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the sterile latex snapping against my wrists, and pushed through the heavy door. Row upon row of covered forms lay still, each a testament to a life ended, a story waiting to be told or, in this case, retold. I located the gurney holding the remains of the victim. The sheet was still draped over him, a white shroud against the steel. I lifted it, revealing the familiar contours of what was once a living man. My eyes immediately went to the areas I'd flagged, the subtle fractures, the unusual abrasions. They weren't consistent with a simple fall. But I needed more. Something undeniable. Something that spoke of intent, not chance. I had meticulously cleaned every surface, every fragment during the initial examination, but I knew forensic science was a game of infinite regressions. There was always another layer, another detail, if you looked hard enough. I wheeled the gurney under a focused examination lamp, its beam cutting through the ambient gloom. I pulled out my portable digital microscope, its camera feeding directly to a small, ruggedized tablet. Starting at the cranial vault, I systematically worked my way down, my gaze sweeping over every inch of exposed bone and desiccated tissue. I focused on the microscopic, the things invisible to the naked eye. I scraped beneath fingernails again, re-examined hair follicles, checked the deep creases of the skin for embedded particulates. My initial report had noted some environmental contaminants consistent with the accident scene, but nothing unique. Nothing that screamed "this doesn't belong." Hours bled into a seamless continuum of intense focus. My neck ached, my eyes burned, but I pushed on, fueled by a relentless conviction. Then, near the lateral epicondyle of the left humerus, a spot I'd previously dismissed as a minor abrasion from the fall, I saw it. Under the microscope, it wasn't just a scrape. They glinted, catching the light in a way that was utterly foreign to organic matter or common environmental dust. I carefully extracted a few of the particles with microtweezers, placing them onto a clean slide. Under higher magnification, their structure became clearer. They were angular, almost crystalline, yet undeniably synthetic. Not a natural mineral, not common industrial grit. This wasn't from a pavement fall. This was something specific. My mind raced, sifting through databases of industrial materials, obscure contaminants, and specialized alloys. I'd seen similar properties in the past, but always in specific contexts. This particular combination of metallic luster and crystalline structure, the pearlescent hue. It triggered a memory. A recent environmental impact assessment report I'd skimmed, dealing with a new, controversial mining operation on the city's outskirts. They were experimenting with novel extraction processes, using a proprietary solvent system and a unique filtering agent. The victim, an urban planner, had been outspoken against that very project. It wasn't just a random connection. It was a direct link. The particles weren't just present, they were embedded with force, indicating contact with the source at the moment of injury, or shortly before. This wasn't an accident. This was a message, hidden in plain sight. I packed my samples, my hands steady despite the tremor of excitement and apprehension that now coursed through me. I needed to know who else had access to this information, who else might have overlooked or, worse, ignored this detail. My mind immediately went to the processing technician, a meticulous individual named Silas, who had been on duty during the initial examination of the remains. He was thorough, almost obsessive, but also easily swayed by authority. He wouldn't have intentionally missed anything, but he might have been told what not to see. I found Silas in a break room, hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring blankly at a wall poster detailing proper biohazard disposal. His shoulders were slumped, and the usual meticulousness in his uniform seemed to be missing, replaced by a subtle dishevelment. He looked tired, almost haunted. "Silas," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the vending machine. He startled, nearly spilling his coffee. His eyes, usually sharp, were unfocused for a moment before snapping to mine. "Marcus. Didn't hear you come in." "I have a few questions about the recent accidental death case," I began, keeping my tone even, devoid of accusation. "Specifically, the environmental contaminants you noted in the initial report." He shifted uncomfortably, running a hand over his thinning hair. Everything was logged. Standard city grime, a few fibers from the clothing, concrete dust from the fall site. Nothing unusual. "Are you certain?" I pressed, stepping closer. "Did you notice any specific metallic particulates? Small, iridescent, almost pearlescent?" Silas's gaze darted to the poster, then back to me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Fear? Recognition? No. Nothing like that. My scope would have picked it up. His voice was tight, a little too defensive. My scope picked it up, Silas. Embedded in the humerus. I watched him closely. His face paled, and he swallowed hard. These particles are unique. They point directly to the new mining operation. An operation the victim was actively fighting. He wrung his hands, his coffee cup rattling against the table. I just followed protocol, Marcus." The detective, he said it was an open and shut. An accident. He told me to focus on confirming the fall, the impact points. And not to look too closely at anything else? I finished for him, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Silas looked away, his jaw working. He just made it clear what they were looking for. What was important. He finally met my gaze, and I saw it then, not malicious intent, but the quiet desperation of a man trying to keep his head down, caught between a rock and a hard place. I saw a few odd specks, yeah. Nothing definitive, I thought. Just unusual. I logged them as unidentified trace particulates and then I moved on. It wasn't deemed relevant. My frustration flared, but I tamped it down. This wasn't malicious, but it was complicity born of fear or pressure.
Who told you to move on, Silas? The detective, or someone higher up?
He hesitated, glancing around the empty break room as if walls had ears. A colleague of his. From the precinct.
He was present during the initial review. Said it was important to keep things streamlined for the report.
A colleague. Not just the detective. The web was beginning to spread. The first thread was pulled, and it was leading me somewhere far more intricate than I had anticipated. And Silas, a minor player, had just given me the first name in a much larger game. Tonight, it felt different, laced with an unsettling premonition. The words of the detective, the implication of a colleague's involvement, they echoed in the silence, distorting the low hum of the refrigeration units into a predatory growl. I moved between the stainless steel bays, each containing a silent story, but my mind kept circling back to the victim of the accidental fall, the man whose bones had screamed a different truth. But I wasn't looking for anomalies, I was looking for patterns, for the deliberate absence of what should have been there, and the subtle presence of what shouldn't. The air, heavy with the scent of disinfectant and formaldehyde, seemed to press in on me, a physical manifestation of the mounting pressure. My microscope, usually a portal to microscopic wonders, now felt like a lens into a web of deceit. I adjusted the focus on a slide prepared from the victim's tibia, the prepared section thin enough to reveal the intricate architecture of the bone. The deep marrow, often overlooked in standard toxicology panels, held secrets. I wasn't expecting poisons, not directly, given the accidental ruling.
The precise magnification brought the cellular landscape into sharp relief, a silent tableau under the harsh LED light.
Not a single particle, but a diffuse presence, a subtle alteration in the cellular structure, accompanied by minute, crystalline formations.
These weren't natural.
They were too uniform, too specific, catching the light with an unnatural glint.
I cross-referenced the formations with my personal database, a compendium of obscure industrial byproducts I'd cultivated over years, a library of the forgotten and the suppressed. This process was known to be employed by a major conglomerate, a corporation whose rapid expansion had been the subject of recent, hushed political discussions. The victim hadn't just fallen, he had been exposed. And that exposure had been meticulously hidden beneath the guise of an accident, the microscopic evidence buried deep where few would look. The air in the facility, already frigid, seemed to drop another 10 degrees. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the far end of the corridor, where the main entrance was. A prickle of alarm, sharp and insistent, crawled up my spine. This wasn't the usual nocturnal creak of an old building settling. Footsteps. Deliberate, heavy, not the hurried scuffle of a night shift worker. They were approaching my section. I peered through the narrow gap between two refrigeration units, my breath misting in the frigid air. Tall, broad-shouldered. Not the detective. Not the colleague I'd initially suspected. This was a different kind of presence. A predator. He stopped at the entrance to my bay, his gaze sweeping the empty workstations, then lingered on mine, as if sensing my presence in the unnatural quiet. He didn't speak, but a metallic glint in his hand, catching the faint light, communicated everything. He was here for me. My discovery had not gone unnoticed, and my continued existence was now a liability. They knew. My quiet digging, my refusal to accept the official narrative, had reached the ears of those who wielded power far beyond the precinct house or the university. This wasn't just about a cover-up, it was about eliminating loose ends. I had to move. The figure took a slow, deliberate step into the bay. I knew the layout of this facility better than anyone. There was a maintenance crawl space behind the last row of refrigeration units, rarely used, often unlocked. My only chance. I timed my move with the hum of a larger compressor unit kicking in,
the sudden surge of sound momentarily masking my own slight shift. I slipped silently behind the units, the narrow space barely accommodating my frame. The air grew thicker, warmer, smelling of dust and ozone. I heard the figure move closer to my workstation, the scrape of something being moved, a soft curse. He knew I was gone, but not where. My heart hammered a rhythm against the cold metal wall, a primal drumbeat of survival. This wasn't a game of forensic puzzles anymore. This was a hunt. And I was the prey. The system, the very framework I had always believed in, was compromised. My life, my career, everything I had built, it was all secondary now. The truth, and the man whose bones I had vowed to speak for, demanded more. I had to disappear, at least for a while, and re-emerge as something they wouldn't expect. The sounds of the facility receded behind me, replaced by the faint thrum of distant traffic, indicating I was nearing an external access point. I wouldn't be going home tonight. I wouldn't be reporting to the university tomorrow. Every official channel was now a potential trap. They were wrong. The game had changed. And I was ready to play. He'd spoken of a pattern, a carefully constructed illusion of natural decay, and a powerful adversary. My colleague, a renowned expert in his own right, had been the one to initially corroborate the accidental death ruling. The thought was a bitter bile in my throat. Could he have been manipulated, or worse, complicit? I pushed the questions aside, directing my gaze back to the specimen under the powerful microscope. It wasn't the victim's remains this time. The core bone samples, the ones that had first screamed foul play to my intuition, had been processed. Now, I was looking at the microscopic debris extracted from the deepest fracture lines, the ones that had been dismissed as post-mortem damage. The initial analysis had yielded nothing conclusive, just generic environmental detritus. But I had a hunch. I'd spent the last 24 hours in a near trance, re-examining every particle, every fiber, every speck of dust collected from the victim's remains. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of forensic dissection, meticulously adjusted the focus, inching through layers of cellular structure. Then, I saw it. A glint, almost imperceptible, embedded deep within a microfissure of the victim's tibia. It wasn't organic. It wasn't a common mineral. It was a fragment, barely a micron across, with an unusual crystalline structure and a faint, almost iridescent sheen. My breath hitched. This wasn't natural. This wasn't accidental. This was alien to the human body and the natural world around it. I carefully isolated the fragment, transferring it to the scanning electron microscope. The image bloomed on the screen, magnified thousands of times. The intricate lattice work of the material was unlike anything I'd encountered in standard forensic literature. It was a polymer, certainly, but one with a specific, engineered complexity. A synthetic signature. I cross-referenced its elemental composition against proprietary material databases, something I usually only did for industrial espionage cases, not homicides. The hours bled into one another, the hum of the machinery a constant drone. My eyes burned, but I couldn't look away. Then, the match. Not a perfect one, but a close enough approximation to trigger a cascade of related patents and material science papers. The polymer was a newly developed composite. Patented by a major technology conglomerate, the very corporation whose executive had been lobbying for the land deal that the victim had been publicly opposing. The specific variant I held under the lens was listed as a prototype component for an advanced drone system, designed for rapid deployment and silent operation. A system that had been undergoing secret field testing in the remote area where the victim's body had been found. My mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The victim wasn't just found near the testing site, they were the testing site's unintended casualty. Or perhaps, a deliberate target. The specific fracture pattern on the victim's skull, initially attributed to a fall, suddenly made horrifying sense. It wasn't a blunt object. It was a high-speed impact from a relatively small, dense object, precisely the kind of impact a malfunctioning or deliberately deployed drone component could inflict. The accidental fall was a fabrication, a clumsy attempt to mimic common trauma after the true cause of death. The powerful figures involved wouldn't want a prototype drone linked to a civilian death, especially not one who was publicly challenging their interests. This wasn't just a murder, it was an execution, orchestrated to look like an accident, and then meticulously covered up. The colleagues' involvement suddenly made sense, too. Who better to lend scientific credibility to a false narrative than a respected expert? The corporate executive, shielded by layers of legal and political influence, had likely used their resources to ensure the initial findings pointed away from their proprietary tech. I leaned back from the microscope, rubbing my temples. The weight of the discovery settled on me, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a detonation. I had the definitive link, the smoking gun forged from synthetic polymers and corporate greed. And they had nearly gotten away with it. My phone lay on the workbench, a lifeline, but also a potential vulnerability. Who could I trust? The detective, certainly. But how many others were compromised? How deep did this conspiracy run? My muscles tensed. It was probably just a security guard making rounds, but the sound, in that moment, felt like a prelude. I had proof, incontrovertible evidence that could bring down powerful people. And powerful people had a way of ensuring inconvenient truths, and those who discovered them, vanished. The game had changed. I was no longer just speaking for the dead, I was now squarely in the crosshairs of the living. I stood before the stainless steel drawer containing the remains of the victim, my breath misting in the frigid air. The intricate pattern of microfractures on the skull, the subtle discoloration of specific bone sections, the faint, almost imperceptible residues I'd meticulously collected, they were no longer abstract data points. They were a story, screaming for an audience. I had spent the last 24 hours in a near frenzy, cross-referencing, re-examining, and documenting every shred of evidence. The initial accidental death ruling had been a carefully constructed edifice, designed to crumble only under the most precise, relentless scrutiny. My scrutiny. Now, I held the wrecking ball. A heavy sigh escaped me, the sound swallowed by the vast, silent room. It was time. The meeting room, several floors above, was a stark contrast to the glacial quiet of the storage facility. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable weight that pressed down on the polished mahogany table. The detective sat opposite me, his gaze unreadable, flanked by a stern-faced prosecutor and a representative from the mayor's office, a man whose tailored suit seemed to bristle with corporate authority. Across from them, fidgeting slightly, was the senior corporate executive, the man whose company stood to gain billions from the land deal at the heart of this deception. And then there was my colleague, the senior anthropologist, whose initial assessment had conveniently supported the accidental death narrative. His eyes, usually sharp, darted nervously between the faces around the table, avoiding mine. I placed my evidence kit on the table, the clinking of instruments echoing in the strained silence. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through me. "I appreciate you assembling on such short notice. What I'm about to present will, I believe, necessitate immediate action." I clicked a remote, and the projector behind me cast an image onto the screen, a detailed scan of the victim's cranium. The initial report cited blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, I explained, pointing to a specific area on the image. However, my analysis, utilizing advanced micro-CT scanning and elemental residue mapping, shows something far more deliberate. I zoomed in, highlighting a cluster of microscopic fractures. These aren't impact fractures from a single fall. These are perimortem fractures, meaning they occurred around the time of death. More specifically, they show a pattern of multiple, low-velocity impacts, delivered with a specific instrument, not the result of striking a natural surface. The corporate executive shifted, clearing his throat. "Marcus, are you suggesting this was not an accident?" His voice was smooth, practiced, but I caught the tremor beneath. "I'm stating it unequivocally," I countered, my gaze locking onto his. "The victim was struck repeatedly, likely in an attempt to incapacitate, before the final, fatal injury was inflicted." I then brought up images of the victim's extremities. Furthermore, the pattern of bruising and specific bone stress indicators on the distal phalanges of the left hand suggest defensive wounds. And here, gentlemen, is where the initial report truly falters. In the microscopic grooves within these fractures, I found trace elements, a unique alloy, typically used in specialized industrial tools, combined with a particular lubricant. This specific signature points directly to equipment used by the corporate executives company, equipment that was, conveniently, under maintenance and unaccounted for during the time of death. A gasp rippled through the room. The prosecutor leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. The senior corporate executive's face, previously composed, began to drain of color. "But there's more," I continued, my voice hardening as I turned to my colleague. "A thorough examination, one that should have been standard, would have revealed these anomalies. It suggests either gross incompetence or, more disturbingly, deliberate omission." My colleague flinched, his jaw tightening. "That's a serious accusation, Marcus," he stammered, his voice thin. "My findings were based on the information available." "Available, or selectively presented?" I shot back, turning my full attention to him. "The report dismissed the microfractures as post-mortem damage and the trace elements as environmental contamination. A convenient narrative, wouldn't you agree, for a death that needed to be ruled an accident?" I displayed an old email chain, a series of urgent communications between my colleague and a legal representative of the corporate executives company, predating the official report. This correspondence, recovered from a secured server, details concerns about the potential implications of a thorough forensic analysis. Concerns that led to a premature conclusion, a conclusion that benefited the corporate executive's land acquisition and buried the truth of a murder. The air in the room crackled. The detective finally spoke, his voice low, dangerous. "Is this true?" he asked, his gaze fixed on my colleague. My colleague's composure shattered. He gulped, his eyes darting to the corporate executive, then to the floor. I was pressured," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "They said. My career. My reputation. They paid you," I stated, not as a question, but as a fact, recalling the detective's earlier hint. "They paid you to look the other way, to manipulate the evidence just enough to obscure the truth." The senior corporate executive slammed his fist on the table, a sudden, desperate show of force. "This is outrageous. Baseless speculation. My company is being slandered." "Slander?" I scoffed, turning to face him directly. "Or justice, finally arriving? The victim was a local activist, wasn't he? Leading the opposition to your company's land development, threatening to expose your questionable practices. His death, ruled an accident, conveniently removed him from the equation. But the dead, they speak. And I just listen." I laid down the final piece of evidence, a small, almost imperceptible fragment of bone, still embedded with a unique synthetic fiber. This fiber, found deep within a wound not visible externally, matches the uniform material of the corporate executive's security detail, a detail that was present at the site on the night of the victim's death. The same detail that has since been disbanded, their records conveniently purged. The prosecutor stood up, his face grim. "Mr. Executive," he said, his voice ringing with authority, I believe you have some explaining to do. Detective, secure the room. No one leaves. The corporate executive rose slowly, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and fear. He looked at me, a silent threat passing between us. But the game was over. The truth, meticulously exhumed, was now undeniable. The fate of the conspirators, once secure behind layers of influence and deceit, now hung precariously on the edge of a precipice, with justice finally staring back at them. The corporate executive's eyes, burning with a mix of impotent rage and stark terror, were the last thing I saw before the uniformed officers moved in. The room, once thick with the suffocating silence of a truth struggling to surface, erupted. The chief investigator gave me a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of the battle won. The handcuffs clicked, sharp and definitive, severing the executive from his carefully constructed world of impunity. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings and media frenzy. News channels broadcasted endless analyses, their anchors dissecting every detail of the elaborate cover-up. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. The sheer audacity of the scheme, turning an intentional act into a tragic accident, all to protect profit margins and political careers, ignited a firestorm of indignation. I found myself pulled into a whirlwind of depositions, expert testimonies, and hushed conversations with prosecuting attorneys. Each time I spoke, I felt the weight of the deceased's story, the responsibility to articulate what their broken bones and silent tissues had revealed to me. The trials moved swiftly, fueled by the undeniable evidence I'd painstakingly unearthed. The corporate executive, stripped of his power and surrounded by legal counsel, looked a fraction of the man who had threatened me with his gaze. His co-conspirators, a network of complicit officials and corporate strategists, were systematically dismantled. The judge's gavel, when it finally fell, echoed with the full force of justice served. Sentences were handed down, careers were ruined, and the machinery of deceit ground to a halt. For the families of the victims, there was a fragile sense of closure, a hard-won peace that came at an immense cost. But for me, the victory felt incomplete. The public lauded my work, calling me a hero, a voice for the voiceless. The personal cost had been immense. Sleep had become a fleeting acquaintance, haunted by the specter of what humanity was capable of. My professional life, once a quiet pursuit of anatomical truths, was now perpetually under a microscope, scrutinized by those who admired and those who resented. The air inside was always cool, carrying the faint, metallic tang of preservation fluids and the subtle, earthy scent of humanity returned to its basic elements. Rows of stainless steel. Tables gleamed under the fluorescent lights, each draped form a silent teacher, a repository of lessons yet to be learned. I walked between them, my footsteps muted on the tiled floor, the only sound the low hum of the ventilation system. This was my sanctuary, a place where the clamor of the outside world faded, and I could reconnect with the core of my purpose. I paused beside a covered form, not one from the recent case, but an anonymous donor whose generosity allowed others to understand the intricate machinery of life and death. It was here, amidst these silent instructors, that I felt the true weight of my profession. I had spoken for the dead, yes, but in doing so, I had also disturbed the powerful. The chief investigator had warned me, his voice low and gravelly, during a late-night phone call. "You've cut off a few heads of the Hydra, Marcus," he'd said. "But the beast itself, it still lives. These aren't just individuals, they're symptoms of a system." I had seen it in the subtle shifts in the political landscape, the way certain legislative initiatives designed to prevent similar abuses were quietly stalled, or watered down. I'd noticed the way some of the executive's less prominent associates, those whose involvement was harder to prove, simply vanished from public view, only to reappear months later in new, equally influential positions. Just last week, an unmarked envelope had arrived at my office. Inside, a single, high-resolution photograph. It was a candid shot of me, taken from a distance, walking out of my apartment building. There was no message, no threat, just the unsettling implication that I was still being watched, that my movements were noted. I hadn't reported it. What was there to report? A photograph? I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. My expertise, once a shield for the truth, had also made me a target. My gaze swept across the silent forms in the facility, each one a testament to life's fragility and death's finality. I had given them a voice, brought their stories to light. But the powerful figures who wished to bury the truth forever, they hadn't disappeared. The fight for justice, I understood then, was not a single battle to be won, but a relentless, ongoing vigil. And I, Marcus, the one who spoke for the dead, was now firmly entrenched in its unforgiving landscape.